Whenever people talk about the golden era of the Final Fantasy series, this is in reference to the mainline titles of 6 through 10, with Tactics and Chrono Trigger sometimes getting grouped in there as well. Looking through those games, there's one very clear black sheep among the bunch. That's Final Fantasy VIII. 6, 9, and Tactics are the critical darlings of the group, the ones that the self-labeled true fans love to hang their hats on as the underappreciated gems of the series, while 7 and 10 were considered all-time greats, as well as being two of the best-selling games of their generations. And Chrono Trigger wasn't a Final Fantasy game, but it was made by a lot of the prominent Final Fantasy team members like Hironobu Sakaguchi, Yoshinori Kitase, and Tetsuya Takahashi. Then there's Final Fantasy VIII. It reviewed extremely well upon release, and sold just as many copies as 10 did, but it never quite resonated with fans the same way that the other games of this generation did. While most people will always gravitate towards 13 as being the worst Final Fantasy, 8 is by far the most divisive of the series. It's really a love it or hate it style game. So let's jump in and see if Final Fantasy VIII really is that bad. We start off with one of, in my opinion at least, the best opening cutscenes ever, but there's definitely some nostalgia goggles going on here. Nobody is going to confuse this for Cyberpunk on a high-end PC by today's standards, but in 1999, that shit blew people's minds. This cutscene does a great job of setting the tone of the game though. Squall is your protagonist, and there's going to be a love story between himself and Rinoa. Seifer is an asshole, and Sorceress Edia is our antagonist. Unfortunately, this excitement doesn't hold up once the game starts. You'll notice that I'm playing this on the PS4 Remastered Edition, because playing this on an original PS1 copy is probably the worst way you can play the game now, but I'll get into that a little later. While the remaster looks substantially better, I do miss the rough pixel edges from the PS1 version. We wake up in the infirmary and get bombarded by a ton of information and character introductions like it's a Kojima plot. This girl is going to be important 20 hours from now. This is our teacher that has a crush on Squall for no reason. There's the asshole from the cutscene being an asshole again. We need to go to the fire cavern. She looks exactly like every other NPC, but she's actually pretty important. We have a seed exam, and this news shocks the students. GFs are just summons that you equip, but instead of saying that, the game gives slow and kinda confusing tutorials over and over again about junctioning. You've been playing this for 7 minutes, so you better be familiar with how the EL-A/D slot above HP turns white, indicating an elemental junction. You go get the GF Ifrit to go along with the two that you already have, and now it's time for that seed exam that you aren't quite sure what it is. We meet Zell, and even the other characters in the game think he's annoying, not the best way to introduce one of the main supporting characters. Before we ship off, we're introduced to the headmaster of Balamb Garden, Cid. The dialogue during this trip is pretty terrible, but it at least shows off the personalities of our characters. We meet Zu, who we see a lot as the game goes on, but is not important at all. She tells us that we're going to Dalit because they're being attacked by the Galbadian military. Cool. After Zu tells us the rundown, Seifer says what the player is likely thinking. What the hell am I supposed to be doing? But cue another cutscene, and now we're taking part in our seed exam. I bring up the whole intro sequence because I always thought that the game should have started right here with the seed exam and our group running out of the boat. Imagine that opening cutscene just flowing into the subsequent cutscene of landing on the shores of Dalit. I feel like the tutorials we got could have been pretty easily incorporated into the Dalit mission instead. Then things like showing Selphie around Garden and going to the Fire Cavern could also have been pretty easily moved to after the Seed mission. Say before going to the graduation party, Selphie just switches her dialogue around and instead of being late for class, says, "Man, this has all been going so fast, I'm already a Seed, but I don't even know my way around yet." Now you still have Squall give her the tutorial of Garden. Instead of having Siren as a missable GF, let Selphie start with it equipped, so you still have 3 GFs for your 3 characters. Could have been added in that while Sid worked out the details of their contract with Rinoa, the team was then sent to the Fire Cavern to get Ifrit. Final Fantasy VIII has a ton of pacing issues, especially towards the end of the game, but even as a kid, I always thought that the beginning felt very out of order, and that sentiment still stands 2 decades later. Despite having no clue about the bigger picture, the player does understand the basics though. You get an idea about your character's personalities, and you know that they're trained to become some type of mercenaries. While I think it's all a little bit out of order, and the game does make the junction system way more complicated than it needs to be, but overall it's a pretty solid introduction into the game, and should be more than enough to keep players intrigued. Before going over the main plot points of the game, let's start with the characters because it's one of the biggest criticisms of Final Fantasy VIII. There's a reason why that opening cutscene only focuses on a handful of characters. The emphasis is clearly placed on the stories of Squall and Rinoa, while everyone else is very much in the supporting character tier. This is in direct contrast to Final Fantasy VI, where even though Terra is the main character, the writers wanted to try and feature multiple protagonists depending on the player's perspective. Then in 7, even though Cloud, Tifa, and Aerith are the 3 main characters, the whole ensemble brings something to the narrative. When people say that the characters in 8 are bad, it's probably about half that just don't like the characters. The other half is really just criticizing how the narrative is written. They fully intended for everyone else to take an obvious backseat to Squall and Rinoa. But the other characters do have more personality than people tend to give them credit for, even if those personalities don't always resonate. One thing holding back the supporting characters is they all have the same background. They're all seeds from Balamb Garden except for Rinoa. Well, technically Irvine too, but outside of one plot point we'll talk about later, he's basically the exact same thing as everyone else. In turn, this means that the writing definitely struggles at times to give these supporting characters a true purpose in actually supporting the plot. By Disc 3, no one outside of Squall, Rinoa, and Laguna really do anything of note. Hell, Quistis doesn't even really do anything after Disc 1. Millions of people were introduced to 7's cast where Cloud, Tifa, and Aerith drove the narrative, while everyone else still had important reasons for being around. Barrett was leading Avalanche, Sid gave us access to the Tiny Bronco and the High Wind, Vincent's backstory reveals a lot more information about Hojo, Genova, and Sephiroth, while Yuffie has side quests that centered around Wutai and the Turks. A ton of the plot around the Lifestream is revealed to us through Nanaki and Cosmo Canyon, and Kate Sith is still a terrible fucking character. You get very little of that from Final Fantasy VIII. While a couple of the characters get little moments to shine, it's usually very surface level and doesn't really do anything important for the narrative. But let's get into it, and this is where spoilers will start popping in. For now though, I won't cover anything past Disc 1 and the initial fight against Edea. Just like his game, Squall is probably the single most divisive character in the series. Not even main character, just character in general. He tends to be firmly in that love him or hate him category, but you'd be surprised at how many people list him as their favorite Final Fantasy protagonist. I wouldn't say he's my favorite by any means, but I would make an argument that he's one of the best written characters in the series. I'd say he's at least one of the most misunderstood characters. Take that with a grain of salt, because being well written and being likable are 2 very different things. Let's take a look at Squall. What are his traits? He's introverted, pragmatic, hardworking, brave, self-aware, calm under pressure, a great soldier. All of those sound very promising, so what's the catch? What's the other side always harp on? Well, he's a massive dick to everyone. Let's hit the bullet points for those character traits. Squall is very reserved. You're probably saying, well, so were characters like Cecil and Cloud. Yeah, but those characters also had qualities that made others gravitate towards them, and they were far quicker to lighten up during the process. In Squall's case, his personality genuinely makes the player wonder why anyone cares about this guy at times. Take the dance scene with Rinoa as an example. It's not like Squall learned how to dance perfectly in like 2 minutes. He was only bad at it in the beginning, because he had no interest in doing it. He was happier just being alone, standing against a wall, ignoring everyone. Renoa just tried harder than everyone else to make Squall give a shit. Besides how he treats other people, we spend a good portion of the game getting Squall's inner thoughts that are usually pretty negative, adding to why players have a sour opinion of him. But actually think about his inner dialogues. Are they really that negative? Or are they pragmatic? Squall is an extremely pragmatic character who rarely acts on emotion, so much so that he repeatedly says how he hates thinking too much. He genuinely doesn't like deciding things for himself or others. He likes knowing what he needs to do and doing it. Squall wants to live in a world of black and white. He was raised to be a soldier, not a leader. He's most comfortable being told what to do and then excelling at it. This is one of the things that people always cite as a reason that Squall is relatable. There are times in life when you just need to rip a band-aid off and face reality, even if that reality isn't always favorable. This is how Squall thinks. When his feelings towards a mission don't matter, he doesn't like being asked about his feelings. He flat out says he dreamt he was an idiot when talking about Laguna because, well, Laguna is kind of an idiot. When Quistis looks to him for comfort after being demoted, he doesn't understand how to be empathetic because all he can see is that there's nothing that he can do to overturn Cid's decision. Quistis is just a regular seed, and the quicker she accepts that, the quicker she can get over it. He's pragmatic to a point of borderline robotic behavior. This is a trait that a lot of people live vicariously through. Squall gets to call his coworkers annoying when they're being annoying. Renoa's plan is half-baked and stupid, so he tells her that her plan is half-baked and stupid. Where some players see him as a jerk, others see him as a voice of reason who's not afraid to be the bad guy in a tough situation. Because he's such a pragmatic person, this makes Squall extremely self-aware of who he is. He eventually admits that he really does care what others think of him, but he's trained himself to just push those thoughts out and focus his energy elsewhere. As a result, that robotic pragmatism has led Squall to excel at just about everything he tries that isn't social activity. But this is where his underlying insecurities do show. Where with everything else we've seen, Squall will try his best to improve himself for the situation. When it comes to social interactions and opening up, this is where Squall thinks his best course of action is to further just shut himself down. It's seemingly the one aspect of his character that he isn't self-aware about. So much so that he's confused as to why the rest of the party was surprised when he looked happy that Selphie and her group didn't die in the missile base. In his head, he's just being Squall the Seed. He likes his quiet time and he likes being left alone. He doesn't understand why other people think that's weird. What he also doesn't understand is how everyone else can't tell what's going on in his head. He's pragmatic and self-aware to a fault that he's inadvertently removed almost all feelings of empathy from his own thoughts. These can get grouped together pretty easily once you understand his mindset. Because Squall always focuses on logic over feelings, this lets him take emotion out of almost all situations, leading to his calm demeanor and willingness to throw himself head-on into danger without a second thought. Speaking of which, since Squall actively practices shutting his brain off, this further lets him dive into his responsibilities and training, making him an ideal soldier. We'll touch on this as we go through the major plot points of the narrative, but Squall has no desire to be a leader. In fact, he fucking hates being responsible for other people. It's something that is almost always forced upon him during the game, but there are also times on his own where he shows the qualities of being a great leader without even realizing it. Because of this, the game does put an emphasis on also showing that the rest of the group follows and respects Squall. They might not always like him personally, but they respect him as a leader. Because we've all seen Team America, we all know that sometimes you need to be a dick in order to get the job done. Squall's antisocial behavior isn't all his fault though. And no, I'm not talking about that plot twist on Disc 2 that we'll cover later. What I mean is that Squall seems widely recognized around Garden as being a very good soldier with a ton of potential even before he officially becomes a seed. While Cid says that he wants seeds to see the world and not to become machines, as the group later says to Renoa, they still need to be robotic enough to blindly follow orders, even if it means rushing into a losing battle. This is a place where I think Squall's character shines, and it's a plot point that a ton of players overlook. Despite him wanting to be that robotic soldier that just follows orders, Squall involuntarily shows a ton of leadership qualities. While the love story with Renoa takes the forefront, there is a really well-told coming-of-age style story of Squall becoming a leader despite never wanting it. Take that same scene with Renoa for example. Literally right after telling her that they'll fight her battles for her and just follow orders, he still takes it upon himself to tell her why her plans are bad. The game definitely paints Squall as the jerk here, but he's giving Rinoa tough love. What he's really saying is, even with Seed's help, if you want to achieve your goals, you need to step your game up. And he's right. While Squall and Rinoa are polar opposites at first, we see Rinoa start to understand his thinking after the battles start getting a little too real for her. During the attack against the sorceress, both of them fully acknowledge that she's in over her head. When Squall tells her that he might have to face off against Seifer, this time Rinoa just asks that they're both prepared for what the outcome might be, even if she wishes it wouldn't happen. She's accepting that Squall's been a dick to help keep people alive and have them ready for battle. Squall also doesn't say, "We'll have to kill Seifer." He makes sure to put it on himself as the leader. Right after this, when Irvine starts freaking out about taking his shot on the sorceress, Squall realizes his blunt, tough love approach isn't working here. He switches up his tactics, calms Irvine down, and convinces him that it's just a signal for the Seeds to attack. While Squall is still a bit of a douche to everyone, these are the qualities that make people respect him as a soldier and eventually their leader. Rinoa is in over her head, Irvine is freaking out, Quistis and her group almost botch the entire mission, all while Squall is doing his best to keep everything on track and rushing head-on into battle against the sorceress when everything goes to shit. He might be a bit of a dick, but no one can say that he isn't good at his job. After all that, the negatives are far quicker to go over. He's still a dick, and that's why a ton of people don't like him, which, if you feel that way, is a completely valid sentiment that overrides everything I just talked about. On to Rinoa, and a big part of her character is one of her most divisive features. She's very spoiled and immature. Her luxurious upbringing tends to show itself throughout her early decisions in the game. We learn that she's the daughter of Galbadia's General Caraway, meaning her father is actually one of the most powerful people in the known world. It's also assumed that growing up wealthy is the reason why Rinoa can afford to hire Seeds, where the rest of Timber's resistance groups aren't really actually doing anything. Luckily, Rinoa has a distaste for dictatorships and militaristic expansion, which leads her to leave home and eventually join up with the Forest Owls. But this privileged upbringing leads to Rinoa being extremely naive about the conflicts that she's hell-bent on forcing herself into. This is a huge point of contention between Squall and Rinoa early on. Rinoa is naturally a caring and optimistic person, which blinds her to the fact that simply having good intentions won't help her in battles. She has no clue she's in way over her head until it's too late. Until Seifer is captured and presumed to have been executed, it really doesn't seem like Rinoa understands that there are potentially deadly consequences for her actions. Even after hearing that her first boyfriend was executed for trying to help her cause, it's not really until she's faced with fighting off Eddie's monsters alone that it really seems to click with her. This is a trend that will continue with Rinoa throughout the game. She is pretty firmly in the damsel in distress style character, and just like Squall, this has made her a pretty polarizing female lead. But there is a little more nuance to it outside of just, oh look, Rinoa needs saving again. Her character openly acknowledges that she's lagging behind the rest of the group in combat skills. Who knows, maybe she could turn out to be just as tough as the rest of them, but the game goes out of its way multiple times to tell us that Rinoa just doesn't have the killer instinct and experience of a properly trained soldier. That inexperience puts her in some pretty stupid situations where Squall needs to repeatedly save the day. Is that good writing? Well, that's up to the player to decide, but I can at least appreciate the narrative acknowledging her mistakes through her lack of training. Rinoa is like an average person who signed up for the army, but then somehow ended up on a mission with a group of Navy SEALs. All the characters are intentionally written as immature and flawed, but there are a ton of people online who point at Rinoa as being the most immature character in the cast. Her little section here probably sounded pretty negative, but I didn't mean it that way. It's just her character. If you had to sum her up, the first thing that comes to mind for me is the saying, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions." She always means well, but usually just causes headaches for everyone else along the way. While he's nowhere near as in-depth as Squall's character, Zell has a little bit more than people give him credit for. Hell, towards the end of the game, even at one point Squall acknowledges that he should probably give Zell a little bit more credit too. But let's go back to the beginning. Within minutes of meeting him, you know Zell's personality. He's got a face tattoo, wears Jenko jeans, is really hyperactive, and probably thinks that Limp Bizkit is an amazing band. Normally that would be all you need to know, but there is a little bit more behind his personality. There's plenty of times where the group heads to a new location or city, and Zell is the first one to chime in with a quick history lesson, even if he doesn't always know the whole story. His grandfather was a decorated soldier in the last war, and that was something that Zell was very proud of, which prompted him to enlist in Garden to try and be like his role model. While most characters see him as annoying or too in your face at first, this is just because Zell tries his best to be a good person and to be nice to everyone he comes across. By nature, Zell is naturally an optimistic and outgoing person, clearly meant as the foil to Squall's more reserved and sometimes pessimistic nature. As the game goes on, he kinda turns into Squall's right-hand man, in the rare times that Squall actually accepts some help or passes on responsibilities. But a lot of players can't overlook his personality and tend to stick to that annoying part. The other three, they don't really have that much going for them. I'm sure that'll trigger some of the fans of the rest of the cast, but it's kind of the truth. Quista seems like the obvious candidate for some kind of redemption arc or becoming the secondary leader behind Squall, but as we just said, it tends to be Zell who fills this role after Disc 1. This leaves her without much to do, and I feel like half the time she talks, it's just about how Squall likes Renoa more than her. If you look at her character, or if you look online, there's a lot of the whole she's the big sister and she's there to represent platonic friendships, but I don't know. If you keep her around as the third party member for most of the game, it just kinda seems like she's really jealous of Renoa. Irvine, I think he sucks. I fucking hate Irvine. He is my least favorite character in the game, but I'll get into that as we go through the narrative. Selphie is probably the most realistic character in the game. She's energetic, doesn't think things through, and has kind of a dark sense of humor. It's kinda ironic that back in 1999, the character who tries to get this world's version of social media going is also named Selphie. Something that players overlook, or just don't give a shit about, is the computer's blogs and diaries that Selphie tries to start up. They're pretty short, but do give players a little more information on the game's lore and some of the characters' inner thoughts. While Selphie is usually the most upbeat person in the group, there are times where it seems like she's also using this as a way to stop herself from letting negative feelings creep in. Final Fantasy VIII is a very straightforward, turn-based JRPG. Once you understand the ins and outs of the junction system, there is very little variance in the gameplay from the first hour to the last. You don't really get any new abilities or anything that will change combat in a meaningful way. Back in the late 90s, the materia system in Final Fantasy VII was considered really in-depth. You gained access to things that changed up your normal attacks like Death Blow, Slash All, and Double Cut. You had all materia to target more enemies, things like HP and MP Absorb to mess around with. Enemy skill gave characters a ton of new options, and you could chain together late-game materia like Mime, Counter, and Quadra Magic to make some really ridiculous combos. Not to mention that different weapons and armor allowed for more or less materia to be equipped, and some also had materia level up at different increments. With 7, there was a lot of variance and things to play around with. Not so much in Final Fantasy VIII. The junction system is a fantastic idea, but it did have terrible implementation. This is mostly due to the draw mechanic. So, you junction magic to your stats, and that determines how powerful your characters are. The word junction is just a fancy way of saying equip. The developers wanted to eliminate grinding for levels, but instead they just replaced traditional level grinding with grinding specifically for magic. At least on subsequent playthroughs, you know what spells to watch out for and stock up on. But on a first playthrough, you have no fucking clue what's good and what isn't. Which means that a ton of players waste so many hours loading up on spells that they are never going to use or junction. You also don't realize how pointless low-level magic is your first time around. Everyone's first instinct is going to be to stock up on the JRPG staples like Fire, Blizzard, and Thunder, but those spells are completely pointless. And God bless your heart if you're someone who tried to keep each individual character equipped with their own GFs and spells. That is the worst way you can play the game. You want to load everything possible into 3 sets, and just keep that junction exchange tab going anytime characters need to be swapped. This is why I say that playing on an original PS1 version is the worst possible way to play the game. You'll waste hours grinding for spells, be it through drawing or through playing a ton of triple triad, as opposed to the remastered version that has the speed up time option. There's probably some purists out there who say it's better to not use the speed up function, but I don't get that idea here. It's nothing but a waste of time if you have a better option available, and that's what the remastered version gives you. This option is such a good quality of life improvement because to get the full stat bonus, you need to stock up 100 of each spell that you want to junction. Really, that means stockpiling 300 of each spell because you need to do it for each active party member. This gets old so fast. That's 300 times for a single spell that you want. On average, you'll draw anywhere from 4 to 10 of a spell with one draw. If your magic stat isn't high enough, you can get even lower or fail the draw entirely. This means that by the end of the game, you'll be drawing magic thousands of times. Now you might be thinking, well, yeah, this does sound really tedious, but it also sounds really rewarding. I mean, you're putting all this time in, but then you get to build your characters exactly how you personally want. Well, not really. Because Final Fantasy VIII has so many GFs, 16 in total, that you can equip to the characters, it becomes pretty easy to allocate them so that each character has the exact same junctions. Not to mention that you can also buy item scrolls that teach them specific stat boosting junctions too. The only real difference is that you equip abilities like Recover, Revive, Devour, or Treatment. But these are basically just free uses of spells like Asuna and Life, or items like X Potions and Phoenix Downs. It's not really anything unique. There are only a handful of battle abilities, like Mug, Counter, or Initiative, that actually change the flow of fights, but even then, it's pretty minuscule. Then things like Card Mod or Devour, they're just abilities that aid in stat grinding. In the early game, you can have certain characters with higher strength, higher hit points, or better magic, but by the middle and definitely the end of Disc 2, more than likely all your characters are going to have right around the exact same junctions. The only real difference will be who you allocate the plus 20 and plus 40% bonuses to. And using a physical attack or two is going to do just as much, if not more damage, than magic or summoning a GF with a much quicker animation time. Let's focus on that last sentence for a second. When Final Fantasy VII came out, people were amazed by the summon animations and how you could just do that right in the middle of an active battle. In 1997, believe it or not, this was a very impressive feat. In 8, I think they got a little too excited for what they could do with the updated graphics. Some of these summon animations take entirely too long, and the damage output is nowhere near worth the wait. You can boost their damage by mashing square during the animation, but that also gets old really quick too. It's also kind of counterintuitive to use magic sometimes. The strongest spells give you the best junction stat bonuses. Makes sense, but that also means that using spells you have junctioned will then chip away at your character's stats little by little, forcing you to then draw more of that goddamn spell. What does all this mean? The easiest and most time-effective way to play the game is to just raise your strength stat as high as possible and spam basic attacks for the entirety of the playthrough. If that sounds good to you, then you're in luck. Final Fantasy VIII is an extremely easy game to break. Yes, you can grind triple triad for specific items that get you endgame spells and weapons very early on, but that's the sucker's way of breaking Final Fantasy VIII. A much simpler way is to equip Shiva and Quetzalcoatl to Squall and make sure the first things they learn are the strength and hit point junctions. Now you can head to the Fire Cavern and get Ifrit. Once you have him, give him to Quistis and teach him the hit point junction. Go down to the shoreline and fight some of these fish that give you a decent amount of AP for the early game and will speed up learning those stat junctions. But more importantly, they also drop the fish fin item. You only need 15 of these fish fins. Once Shiva learns the strength junction, have her then learn Ice Magic Refine. This will let you turn those fish fins into the water spell. Those fish enemies give 3 AP each and usually show up in groups of 2 and sometimes 3. All you need is 80 total AP. So in give or take 12 random encounters with these fish, You can then junction 100 water spells to your two characters' strength stat. Just watch the increase this gives Squall's attack. Before junctioning water to my attack stat, Squall does 70 damage with the Gunblade trigger. After the junction, Squall does 236 damage. For the early game, this is a significant increase and will take out a lot of enemies with just one hit. On top of that, Ifrit can then learn skills that will further increase your strength stat by another 20 and 40% that will stack. Once you get the Brothers GF, which is only a couple hours later, that will let you have all three party members with the Strength Junction ability, and just this junction will carry you through the majority of the game. If you really want to go the extra mile, all you need to do is draw the GF Siren from this boss, which is still during the Seed exam, and have Siren learn the ability Life, Magic, or Fine. 10 tenths, which can be purchased from any shop, will then turn into 100 Curaga spells, and that can give a couple thousand more hit points to a character. Having Water junctioned on Strength and Curaga junctioned on hit points will make you damn near invincible for a large chunk of the game, and it's extremely easy to do this. This isn't some crazy strategy. I figured it out when I was in grade school. Unless you are completely lost with the junction system and picking GF abilities, Final Fantasy VIII is a very easy game. If you don't go this route and are taking damage during fights, don't worry about it, because a ton of enemies and bosses have curative magic equipped that you can just cast from them to heal yourself up. Majority of the time, you don't even need to use your own magic to heal. There's a ton of people online who say that it takes hours and hours to break Final Fantasy VIII on Disc 1, but that's just not true. If you want the absolute best endgame magic and equipment, then yeah, that takes a long time, but it's really unnecessary. The method I just said takes less than 1 hour. Probably more like 10 to 15 minutes with the sped up remastered version, and makes your characters extremely overpowered. By the time enemies start to catch up, you'll then have access to far stronger magic that can replace the water spell. I really like Final Fantasy VIII, but it's an objective fact that it's a horribly balanced game. Unless you completely ignore GFs, magic, triple triad, and using items, this game is really easy. But if you do ignore those things and just grind for levels, you will actually make the game kinda difficult. Enemies are supposed to scale with the player, but at level 30, enemies are as strong as they will be at level 100. Yes, there's no difference in enemy level whether Squall is at 30 or 100. That's a pretty big gap, and it's very easy to hit level 30 because every single level only needs 1000 experience. Getting Squall to level 100 takes just as much experience as getting him to level 10. In an attempt to eliminate level grinding, they in turn made an extremely unbalanced leveling system. If Final Fantasy VIII were to ever get a remake, which I highly doubt it will, I would love to see a more fleshed out version of the junction system, or at least something that makes each character a bit more unique. Just for shits and giggles, I think the junction system would work much better if it was more like D&D's attunement and magic systems. Limit how many GFs one character can equip and how many spells they can store. Instead of having magic as a consumable, have a certain number of spell slots. A defensive GF like Carbuncle could allow you to equip, say, 10 spell slots, but a more offensive and ability-based GF like Bahamut could only allow for 2 spell slots. Have penalties or flat out not be able to do it if you try and equip conflicting GFs like Shiva as an ice elemental and Ifrit as a fire elemental. Or keep those elements in mind when it comes to junctioning. Say if you have Doom Train equipped on another character, status magic gives better junction bonuses and healing magic is less effective. This way, certain spells would be more valuable in the hands of different characters. This would make choosing junctions a lot tougher and would allow characters to stand out a bit more too. Not to mention those abilities like Revive, Recover, and Treatment become extremely more important when every character isn't loaded up with 100 Asuna, Full Life, and Curaga spells to cast at will. Asking for all this from an old PS1 game is pretty unrealistic, but I do think something with modern technology could vastly improve the junction system and turn it into a great mechanic rather than the pretty flawed version we got here. These mechanics, they were also something that was just a little unfortunate with the times. You have to remember, when Final Fantasy VIII was in development, the internet was still a pretty new product. It sounds ridiculous to say now, but it was really common for people in the mid to late 90s to just not have internet access. And the majority of the people who did, it was slow as shit. Loading a page that was nothing but a text file on GameFAQs or CheatCC was still really slow. By the time Final Fantasy VIII came out, they didn't anticipate that a lot of people would be able to just look up what was the best meta to play with. They fully thought that players would miss half the GFs, that they wouldn't know which spells to junction, and that they wouldn't learn the rules of Triple Triad. But the growing accessibility of the internet ruined those plans. What we now see as just grinding and time wasting, developers anticipated as being trial and error ways to improve replayability. The draw mechanics and the junction system just ended up being a big swing and a miss for the most part. Now that I've mentioned it a few times, I can't skip out on Triple Triad. This has a special place in the hearts of most players as being arguably the best minigame in the franchise. Hell, this is what a ton of people cite as maybe being the single best thing about Final Fantasy VIII. It's the definition of easy to learn, hard to master. You have 9 open spaces that you and your opponent take turns putting cards down on. Each card has a 1 through 10 score for each side of said card. Higher number wins, and the player then controls both of those cards. Highest score at the end wins the game. But as the game goes on, the rules get more and more in-depth. Elemental spots come into play with deductions or bonuses to certain cards. The plus and same rules constantly screw you over and do an amazing job of balancing out your overpowered hand against the NPCs, and the random rule is probably the most frustrating thing in the world when you finally get someone to play that card you need, but then the game just gives you the worst possible hand that it can. I won't get too in-depth on Triple Triad, but it is really addicting and fully rewards the player for investing time in it. If you want to go further than the water and Curaga spell junctions that I talked about, you can play some Triple Triad and refine cards into very powerful items and spells that will make your party essentially invincible at any point in the narrative. Gameplay is all in the eye of the beholder here. As I said, it's an objectively flawed combat and leveling system. But if you're someone who enjoys the grind and gets a kick out of seeing your characters destroy everything in their path, then it quickly turns into a very satisfying combat system for those types of players. But if you're more impatient and just want to get on with the game, you're probably going to have a bad time. You certainly don't need every stat and every spell maxed out, but you do need to invest at least a little bit of time drawing magic, playing Triple Triad, or leveling up GF abilities, and some people just don't want to do that anymore. But let's get into the narrative, and full spoilers from here on out. Way back when, in the beginning of this video, we talked about becoming seeds, so let's pick up right after that. We have the seed party, and one of the game's more recognizable scenes where Squall meets Rinoa. This is a scene that a lot of people kind of misinterpret. Squall isn't a bad dancer like he says, he just doesn't want to do it, but Rinoa keeps pressing the issue. Final Fantasy characters tend to be on the younger side, and 8 is no different. Everyone here is 17, with Quistis and Cypher being 18, but this time the writers fully intended to portray them as being those ages. This isn't like Tifa and Cloud being 20 and 21, but they have the composure of full-grown adults. The characters in 8 are meant to be immature, despite their roles as mercenaries. In this scene, Squall only opens up, and dare I say from his little smile at the end, actually lets himself have some fun, because a cute girl is showing interest in him. Something else the writers fully intended was to show how Squall opened up to Rinoa, yet right after, the same efforts from Quistis go completely unanswered. Squall's just not into Quistis, but there was something about Rinoa that he liked. It's a theme throughout the rest of the game, Squall putting up his guard and trying his best to isolate himself, but Rinoa finding different ways to make him open up where everyone else struggles. After the party, we save someone in the training center, and hey, it's that girl from the infirmary that I said would be important way later. I've always been confused as to why the White Seeds thought that the training center would be a good place to hide the rail-thin girl who can't defend herself, but video games do video game things sometimes. When Squall wakes up, we have our first mission, and we're going to the city of Timber. On our way there, our group passes out and we're introduced to our secondary protagonist, Laguna. At first, this is pretty jarring. Other than a handful of random battles, it's all narrative-based, but it's a narrative around 3 brand new characters who are in the enemy's military. And their leader is a complete idiot. Something that both the player and Squall likely agree on. This is a relatively quick sequence though, and we're back on the train to Timber in no time. We go from watching Laguna being an idiot to learning that our clients, the Forest Owls, are also idiots, but that cute girl that Squall liked from the party is their leader. As I said earlier, the characters do have a little more personality than people give them credit for, and we get to see some of it here. Right off the bat, our party knows these guys don't have their shit together, but they try and stay professional. Whereas Squall opened up and had a little fun dancing with Renoa, now that it's a business relationship, he's right back to being stoic and grumpy. Renoa and Squall don't quite see eye to eye on most issues, which leads to more than a few arguments. Unlike the party, we start to see their relationship as Seed Squall and Client Renoa kinda resemble the Student Squall and Instructor Quistis relationship. Even though they graduated, these kids are mercenaries and it's all about doing the job. Squall reverts back to his antisocial standards. Selphie still has her weird sense of humor and Zell still has his ADHD, but they all care about getting the job done, even if they aren't impressed by the Forest Owls. We get a little minigame of stealing a train car that Renoa believes to have Galbadian President Vinzer Delling in it, but it's a trap that Renoa and her group fell for. That throwaway line is actually kinda important to the plot. Remember it for 15 hours later. Forest Owls don't seem too shaken up about getting duped, while Squall and the others are losing patience by the minute. After some running around, Squall eventually loses all of that patience and gives Renoa a reality check during an argument. She runs off as the Seeds watch President Delling give the first live broadcast this world has seen in 17 years, only to have Cypher run in and crash the party. Doing exactly what Squall just said was a stupid move. The age and immaturity of the group is on full display in this scene. Cypher tries to kidnap the president without any real plan or end goal because he thinks it'll help Renoa. Quistis just follows Cypher all the way from Balam to Timber without actually doing anything to stop him. Then Cypher and Zell throw out childish insults until Zell slips up and mentions that they're all from Garden. It's after this that we get our first look at Sorceress Edea since that opening cutscene. She convinces Cypher to accompany her as President Delling runs away. One of the things that most people point to as being not quite plot holes, but pretty big plot conveniences, are why Cypher and President Delling ally with Edea. Well, fast forward a little to the ending, and Edea is actually being possessed by another sorceress from the future, Ultimecia. Sorceress Ultimecia, through Edea, does have the ability to influence others. Ultimecia is in direct possession of Edea because of their connection through the sorceress powers. While Edea can't then possess normal people, she can use their own thoughts to influence their decisions. That romantic dream that Cypher mentioned in Dalit? Well, because he's still just 18, this dream stems from a fictional movie he watched as a kid that featured a knight fighting to save a sorceress. Edea pulls out that memory and influences Cypher into his new role. As for President Delling, Edea pulls out his intentions of conquest and militaristic power, which then makes Delling ally with the sorceress, knowing it'll strike fear into other nations. The game never really explains why the two just up and follow Edea, so there you go. As expected, our group needs to lay low after everything and get out of Timber. Zell gets sad, Quistis further shows how she doesn't really know her students, Squall and Renoa argue more, and Selphie is just kinda there. Everything's status quo, and we head to Galbadia Garden to regroup. On the way, Quistis and Renoa casually talk about how Zone loves porn, and surprisingly this won't be the last time that characters freely talk about porn. Up next, we have another Laguna segment. When I was a kid, I really didn't like the Laguna flashbacks. I thought he was just an idiot and never understood how everything just always worked out for him. But as an adult, I love those things about Laguna. When you're a kid, you're taught to respect your elders, listen to adults, and just assume that they're all smarter than you based off of age alone. Then you start going through your teens and you work your first full-time jobs, only to realize age doesn't mean a goddamn thing. Most adults are still pretty dumb and inexperienced. As an adult, having good luck, favorable circumstances, and knowing the right people are usually much more important than just working hard. That's kind of the tongue-in-cheek humor and theme of Laguna's segments. He's meant to be the opposite of Squall. He's rarely cautious, let alone prepared, and routinely finds himself involved in situations he has no right being the authority figure in. This segment in particular, which results in serious injuries to all three soldiers, they're only in because Laguna had them patrolling the wrong area. Again. Laguna is a dumbass, but he's also someone that people gravitate towards. His carefree attitude lets him not overthink a lot of situations or take himself very seriously at all. I think it's genuinely funny that, as the game goes on, Laguna seems just as surprised as everyone else is that he keeps getting put in positions of authority. Playing the game now, as an adult, Laguna is probably my favorite character. He's a fucking idiot, but he's also a really good portrayal of the everyman style character trope. He just works hard, tries to be nice to people, and does his best. Even if his best isn't that good, it still usually leads to good things. There's also a camaraderie between himself, Kairos, and Ward that just never really shows itself with Squall and the main party. There's a clear friendship between these three that never happens with the main cast of characters. The entirety of this flashback has Laguna being a weirdo, while Kairos and Ward just make fun of him for it. In pure slapstick fashion, Laguna ends the mission by accidentally falling off a cliff. Even later on when the plot starts to pick up, the situations Laguna finds himself in, and usually how he solves them, are just kinda silly. He's a fun character in a game that desperately needed one. Getting sent into the dream world does cut some of the tension in the main group. They wake up and finish the journey to Galbadia Garden. This is something else that the game kinda explains, but not that well. Just because it's in Galbadia, the Galbadian military doesn't actually govern this garden, at least not yet. They work together and do train soldiers for the Galbadian military, but they are technically two different branches. While waiting for new orders, our group learns that Cypher was supposedly executed for his attack on the president. Everyone then talks about Cypher in the past tense, and Squall kinda freaks out about that. On the surface, this is a really weird scene that makes the player feel just as confused as the other characters are. While Squall is no stranger to conflict, this is likely the first time he's really been faced with losing someone that he knew well though, even if that was someone he didn't particularly like. He's also listening to Quistis, Zell, and Selphie not really have any fond memories of Cypher, and he starts to see himself in the same situation should he be killed. Even though they'd both never admit it, Squall and Cypher know each other very well, and are a lot more alike than they realize. Despite their dislike of one another, there does seem to also be a weird form of respect at times too. This all freaks Squall out a little bit, and because he's awkward and antisocial to begin with, he just storms out and leaves the rest of the party wondering what the hell just happened. And they never bring it up again. When everyone regroups, we're given an ominous order that we'll need a sniper to fulfill. Enter our newest character, Irvine, who is by far my least favorite character in the game. He's very important for the plot, but I've always disliked him. Speaking of which, this is where the plot starts to really get going. Galbadia Garden fully understands what the sorceress represents, and knows that she will fully absorb their garden into the military. Balam and Galbadia Gardens give the order to assassinate Sorceress Edia, with Irvine being the sharpshooter. On the train to Delling City, we get a proper introduction to Irvine, and this is why I don't like him. The dude's basically a sexual predator that gets upset when he's told to stop harassing female party members. Even before we get to the train, he tries to put himself in a party with just women and complains if you change it. People defend him by saying, well, he remembers them all as kids, that's why he's acting this way. But is it really normal to walk up to a girl who just became your coworker and be like, hey, I knew you like 10 years ago, wanna fuck? And under that same thought, the second he leaves Selphie alone, he moves right on to Renoa, who he didn't know as a kid, which kinda throws the he's just happy to see them defense out the window. He then throws a little hissy fit about how hard it is being a sniper when Quistis has to yell at him to stop harassing the other girls. Or maybe she's just mad he didn't try it with her. Either way, that's an awful character introduction, and you cannot convince me otherwise. I get it. Like it or not, times were different in the 90s, and this introduction is clearly supposed to be a boys will be boys, he's a wannabe ladies man trope character, but even when I was a kid, I thought Irvine was creeper material. He does show times where he genuinely cares about the group, but his main priority is usually trying to get laid. This gets compounded when he never really has any connection with Squall or Zell to offset his attitude towards the women. It's kinda the opposite actually. There's a little bit of a running gag where Squall always forgets about him, and I don't really remember any direct interactions with just Irvine and Zell. He's just a character that I never liked. Anyway, more plot twists. As we touched on with Renoa, this General Caraway guy is actually her father. It's quick, but I like how there's a scene where Squall has to remind Caraway that he still technically works for Renoa. The two have a quick pissing match that ends after Squall uses the threat of acting accordingly to their contract if Caraway interferes, something that Zell, Selphie, and Quistis stand with Squall on. Another nice little scene is how Squall isn't appointed the leader of this mission in the orders from Garden. Caraway has to ask who will be the leader, and everyone unanimously looks to Squall. Whether they like him personally or not, Squall is the one they view as their superior. Squall then puts Quistis in charge of the other team rather than Zell, and that was probably a mistake. As Caraway, Squall, and Irvine leave, Rinoa comes flying in with another half-baked plan, only to get berated by Quistis. The point of view now changes several times while the tension rises, and the music for these scenes is top-notch. The party gets further briefed on their duties, while both squads get into position. Here's that age and immaturity showing in our characters again. Quistis feels guilty and says she's going back to apologize to Rinoa. Zell and Selphie say that's really dumb and they can't leave their post, yet all three leave their post, even after Quistis tells Zell and Selphie to stay put. Usually things like this bug the shit out of me, when characters purposely do something stupid just for the sake of advancing the plot or padding the gameplay. While this is 100% the characters being stupid, it's at least something that the game gives reason for. Quistis went from student to seed to instructor earlier than most, but she also doesn't have a great track record as an instructor. Case in point, things like this. Quistis isn't really acting out of character with this dumb choice. Our group routinely acts like trained mercenaries, but they also act like immature high school students too, because that's exactly what they are. Especially with modern games, TV, and movies, usually characters do dumb things, and the whole reasoning behind it is, well, they did it because fuck you, don't think too hard about our lazy writing. Final Fantasy VIII is a little different. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that plot conveniences like this one are well written, but I do at least appreciate the writer's attempt to explain why their characters make stupid decisions, which is more than you can say for a lot of media nowadays. As a way to try and protect Rinoa from the fights that are about to unfold, General Caraway sets an extremely convenient timer to lock her in the mansion. Of course, she runs out just in time for the other seeds to get locked in. We now switch to Rinoa's perspective, and wouldn't you know it, her plan to stop the sorceress goes horribly wrong. In the early game, Rinoa means well in all of her actions, but she's completely out of her depth. She becomes desperate to both prove her worth to the members of Seed and prove that she's serious about her resistance in Timber. But all the good intentions in the world can't save her, as Edia knocks her out and places Rinoa in a weird trance, all without so much as even turning her head. This is also another weird scene where the game doesn't really convey what's going on, but I can't really defend this one. Edia gives an incredibly cryptic speech where she essentially announces that she's taking control over Galbadia, and then kills President Delling in front of thousands of people who apparently love it, and the parade goes on like murder and genocide was never a thing. The most common answer I've seen to defend this over the years is that Edia was also using her influence / kind of mind control powers on the whole crowd too, but that's never really conveyed in any meaningful way that I'm aware of. And if that's the case, why don't these powers work on Squall and the others? While I just gave the game credit for trying to explain Quistis' dumb motives, this scene is one of those it needs to happen because the plot demands it style moments that I was just complaining about. Edia's actions here are nothing more than plot convenience. With President Delling dead, Edia says another sacrifice is in order, and she creates 2 monsters out of stone to finish off Rinoa as well. Quistis and her group escape the mansion as the parade starts, and we see that news of Cypher being executed was just a lie told by the Galbadian government. With the parade starting, Squall and Irvine can now get inside to save Rinoa. With Rinoa now safe, she finally starts to realize why everyone has been talking down to her. As Squall says in his head, she's just not ready for all this. As we talked about earlier, with this reality check, Rinoa now understands how real things have gotten and doesn't argue against Squall when he says that he may end up having to kill Cypher himself. Irvine then gets a case of the yips as we switch back to Quistis. And yes, I do think with Irvine right here, it's as clear as the game portrays it. I get that this whole part of the game is just a way to try and raise tension and give the characters something to do, but it then feels a little anticlimactic when you're Quistis and you just run through the sewers and get back to the gate. Squall and Irvine got a mini boss fight along with those cool cutscenes. I feel like Quistis and her group should have had something like that too. Instead, you just get to the gate switch in time for a cutscene to play. With the gate dropped and Edia's float trapped, we swap back to Squall and Irvine. Realizing Irvine's mindset, Squall convinces him to take the shot as nothing but a signal to lead the head-on attack. Irvine's shot is actually dead on, but Edia sees it coming and blocks the bullet. With the sniper failing, Squall goes head on against Cypher and Edia. And Cypher is a massive pushover in this fight. Renoa says that as a group she's brave enough to fight, and Irvine wants to redeem himself, so they join in the fight against Edia. A fight that we lose as Squall takes a bad wound through his chest and shoulder area. As Squall falls from the parade float, that's the end of Disc 1. Disc 2 starts off with another Laguna segment, and this one's quite a bit different than the last two. After their close call patrolling the dig site, Laguna was critically wounded and ended up in the town of Windhill, where he's stayed ever since. He was nursed back to health by a woman named Rain, and as a thanks for this, Laguna stays behind to keep monsters out of the town and help look after a young girl named Alone, who Rain also took in. Kairos and Ward took serious injuries and left the Galbadian army as well. Ward now works in a prison, and Kairos has just kind of been taking time off and looking for Laguna. We also learned that the piano lady Laguna had a thing for that I skipped over in the first dream sequence is actually Renoa's mother. Get used to these seemingly out-of-nowhere personal connections between our characters. There's a lot more to come. With that news of Julia the piano lady marrying General Caraway, if the player didn't figure it out already, this is where it becomes obvious we're seeing the past. Galbadian soldiers in town talk about the ongoing sorceress war between Galbadia and Esthar. This is how that little girl Alone became an orphan. Being a sorceress isn't all that uncommon in this world. Most live completely normal lives, and simply being a sorceress doesn't mean that the person is overly powerful or inherently malicious. The leader of Esthar, Sorceress Adele, was looking for an heir and began kidnapping children across the continent. When Alone's biological parents refused to hand her over, they were killed by Esthar soldiers. Between men being recruited to fight in the war and Esthar actively killing and kidnapping people in an attempt to find a suitable heir for Adele, this left tons of children during this time frame without parents. That's another reason why Laguna stays in Windhill, is since so many people have been drafted into the war, that's allowed monsters to creep further and further into town. As Kairos points out, Laguna doesn't seem all that concerned with moving on from Windhill, and pokes fun at him for not being able to admit it's because there's more than just a friendship forming between he and Rain. Once the flashback ends, we're back to the normal party being held captive in a prison, and Zell mentions how he didn't see Laguna, he was sent back to Ward, working in a prison. How convenient. Squall is taken for some torture and interrogation by Cypher, some other guards beat up Zell, and Renoa's father pulls some strings to get her pardoned. This interrogation sequence with Squall won't make a ton of sense at the time. Edia seems to think Seed's entire purpose is to fight against her, while Squall thinks that Seeds are nothing more than mercenaries, and it was just a job that they were given. Like a couple of other things, we'll return to this plot point soon. But the bigger news is that Edia now plans on hunting down and killing anyone who's a Seed. She's also taken over Galbadia Garden, as expected, but now plans on launching attacks against the other two gardens, Balam and Trabia. Since Zell doesn't fight with weapons, he tricks a guard to open the door and starts the escape process. The prison also has probably the most egregious use of an invisible wall that I've ever seen in a video game. The stairs up and the stairs down are right next to each other, but the game just places an invisible wall right between them that forces the player to then run in a big circle and take the long way up and down each floor. It's really lazy level design. It's also going to be around this point in the game that the player is probably getting really fucking tired of fixing their junctions that the game keeps removing off of characters. Better get used to it though, it's going to keep happening throughout the entire game, and it's never not annoying. Zell returns with the weapons and rescues Quistis and Selphie, who in turn then rescue Squall. The whole group is then rescued by Irvine and Renoa. While he's helping out now, Irvine also had no intentions of saving the group and planned on only leaving with Renoa because he believes they'll just escape on their own eventually. This is another reason why Irvine sucks. Later on we get a flashback to this, and Renoa does have a kind of funny line though. When Irvine says they'll be fine, she retorts with, "But Squall will probably assume that no one has ordered me to escape yet, and he just stays there forever." Which, that would be completely in line with Squall's character. We fight our way out of the prison, and Selphie finally gets something to do. The group sees the first attack against Trabia Garden being launched, and that garden is where Selphie was raised, so this hits her much harder than the rest of the group. She takes over half the party to go try and thwart the next launch on Balam, while Squall and whoever is left go directly to Balam Garden to try and warn everyone of the incoming attack. Selphie's group tries to stay incognito for as long as possible, But eventually we find the move this slider so we purposely miss our target option in their system. Doesn't make a ton of sense for a military to include, but maybe this is why the world is so far behind Esthar in technology. Eventually the group destroys the missile base, but it's not until after the attack has already been launched on Balam Garden. During the escape, they unfortunately get trapped inside and caught in the explosion. When I was a kid, I was really surprised with this and didn't know if those characters were actually dead. Hell, I thought if they killed off Aerith, they can sure as hell kill off Selphie. Shouldn't come as a surprise though, they're fine and found a way to protect themselves at the last second. In hindsight, there's one really easy fix they could have put in to really make the player genuinely question whether they just sent 3 characters to die or not. The game shouldn't have Rinoa be an option to go with Selphie. Yes, for some reason, you can send Rinoa with them, and it should be very clear to the player that Rinoa's not going to die at this point in the game, thus removing any tension from the explosion. A simple line from Squall where he says that Rinoa sticks with him since they're still under contract would make the rest of the characters feel a lot more vulnerable. But, oh well. There's also another little bit of insight into Squall's mindset before this. The group immediately puts the decision of who goes to which location in Squall's hands, something that he does not want to do at all, thinking how he's had enough of this leader thing, and if he's to blame if something bad happens based off of his decisions. It's clear that Squall doesn't want the position of authority that he's been placed in. The last couple missions, he still had people to answer to. He was the group leader, but still had to follow the orders of Rinoa and her contract. After that, he was following the orders of Garden in attacking the sorceress. But now, he's making decisions by himself, and he absolutely hates it. We get back to Garden, and it's safe from the missile attack, but it's also in chaos. Students are running around everywhere, monsters are loose, and it seems like the Garden faculty has rebelled against Cid. For the first time, we hear about somebody named Norg, the Garden Master. Naturally, we take Cid's side and run around fighting until we meet up with Zu, who tells us that Cid's just been sitting in his office the whole time. Now this is something that Final Fantasy VIII does a handful of times throughout the game. Some people look at it as bad writing, but I think it's completely intentional, tongue-in-cheek style humor. Everyone is freaking out, fighting, and the garden is in disarray, but no one thought to double-check the most obvious place to find Cid, in his office. When Final Fantasy VIII was in full production, they decided they wanted a more lighthearted experience compared to the darker themes that Final Fantasy VII had. Case in point, Cid just chilling in his office while all hell breaks loose around him. Another example is right afterwards, when Cid takes 3 steps and falls over, right after saying he's going to try and save the day. Supposedly the garden was originally a shelter of some sort, and he's hoping that there's some big secret hidden in the basement. With the missile attack on the way, we don't really have any other options, so Squall and his group go to check it out. 12 hours into the game, and we're still getting junction tutorials. We make it to the bottom, and Squall turns on some big-ass machine that can create portals through solid material, and don't question how. The garden is now flying, and we get moving just in time to avoid the missile attack. Like a ton of plot points, this seems to come completely out of nowhere, but why the garden is a movable shelter does have an answer that, like a lot of other weird plot points, I'll explain later on when the player gets the full picture. There is actually an in-game reason for this that's never really directly stated. The only problem now, we just don't know how to control it, so Garden crashes into the water and we kinda just drift away while everyone regroups and order is restored in Garden. Rinoa wakes up Squall and asks for a tour, but it gets cut short when we're summoned to meet this Norg guy who calls himself the Garden Master. Cid's already down there and getting pushed around by the staff, and this line that we eavesdrop in on is much more important than Squall currently realizes. Turns out Norg's not even human, he's a member of another race called the Shumi. While Garden was Cid's idea, Norg was the financial benefactor. He really doesn't give a damn about any type of geopolitical positioning, he's just in it for the money at this point. Even though he's not human, Norg is a very successful businessman. Turns out, Cid is just in charge of the day-to-day activities and training students, but Norg is really kind of the one in charge because he's the one signing the checks. Norg's introduction highlights one of Final Fantasy VIII's biggest fan criticisms though, and as I've already brought up a couple times, that's how it conveys plot points. Some massive plot points in this game just come completely out of goddamn nowhere, or are just casually mentioned in dialogue without any real reaction from the characters. We get examples of both here. This Norg guy seems kinda important right now, yet we've only known he existed for like 20 minutes. The second that we learn he's the financial backing of Garden, we immediately beat him up and never see him again. He's either dead or turning into a Moomba. I don't fucking know which, and that's not even a joke. He might be in a Moomba cocoon right now. That's in the game's lore for no reason. Not only that, but Norg just drops a bomb about Sorceress Edea being Cid's wife. This game just has an extremely weird way of giving information to the player, and because it tends to come completely out of left field, it just makes the plot seem overly random at times. Which is a shame, because some of the stuff has very well thought out in-game lore and answers, but that doesn't matter when Final Fantasy VIII routinely struggles to tell its own story that well. Anyway, the true purpose of Cid was to fight against any sorceress who may be evil. This isn't exactly the most financially stable idea, so it's Norg who then made Cid's mercenaries to keep the money coming in. Cid was cool with this because that money then allowed him to keep training more and more Cids. As time went on, Norg stopped caring about the main goal of eliminating another evil sorceress, and he's only worried about his finances. This is what caused the rift and chaos that Squall walked into before the missile attack. Norg never signed off on the assassination attempt, and that was all Cid. As a result, Norg wants to offer the Cids back to Edea in hope that she'll call off the plan to crush Garden. Edea being Cid's wife is also why the two of them wanted to create Garden in the first place, in case the exact same situation happened. Except now, Norg has instead decided to side with that very sorceress as a way of keeping himself rich and comfortable. When you get the bigger picture, it all makes sense. Everything actually lines up pretty well. But a lot of the main plot points are very poorly conveyed to the player, and usually conveyed in a very abrupt, out-of-nowhere manner. Final Fantasy VIII is known for having a batshit crazy plot, which it does, but the problem is much more about how that plot is told. It doesn't help when there's also multiple times where the characters themselves react just like the player. Hell, Squall literally says, "I don't get it," after learning about Cid and Edea's marriage. It makes sense that he doesn't get it, but when the player doesn't get it either, it can then very easily make that same player just think it's an overly forced plot twist. When things in the game aren't really making sense, you probably shouldn't have your characters themselves acknowledge that things aren't making sense. These are big reasons why Final Fantasy VIII gets such a bad rap. After the fight with Norg, Squall further reiterates how he has no clue what's going on. But if you haven't figured it out yet, Squall is dead on with this line of dialogue. After all this is over, we learn that the girl we saved earlier in the training center is actually the grown-up version of Little Alone from Laguna's flashback, and that she's been the one responsible for those flashbacks. This is a scene where people point to Squall as being moody and emo, but try and look at it through his perspective, rather than just the wannabe dramatic, "don't count on me" response. Right after what's essentially his high school/college graduation, he was just tasked with liberating a city and then assassinating a sorceress who's now the leader of a very powerful and militaristic nation. The plan failed, and he was tortured but managed to escape. Now he's a wanted man and knows that his failure is leading to a war between his home and Galbadia, who he believes to be the world's most powerful nation. He's also repeatedly being thrust into leadership roles that he hasn't volunteered for. Let's not forget about those crazy dream sequences where he's sent back in time and learns that the girl who's casually just hanging out in the library is the one doing it, but that she also refuses to tell him what their connection is. There is a reason why Squall gets so frustrated and tells her not to count on him. He's an extremely confused and stressed out 17-year-old kid that does have a lot of problems at the moment. Then, just to pile it all on, she does the complete opposite of what he asks, and her last words to Squall are, "You're my only hope." So yeah, Squall's going through some shit at the moment. But the poor storytelling and rapid-fire plot development doesn't help, and Squall does come across as kinda whiny here. Especially with the inner monologue and never wanting to depend on others while he's in bed curled up in a ball. Oh man. And this next scene is probably where a lot of the emo criticisms come from, because, yeah, it's Kid Squall standing out in the rain all sad, talking about how he's all alone. How could this happen to me? It's important to the overall plot, but yeah, it's not great writing. Eventually, Garden crashes into a town called Fisherman's Horizon, and lucky for us, it's a town full of pacifist mechanics that don't care about property damage. But that pacifist nature doesn't help them out when Galbadian forces arrive. Edea is now looking for a loan too, and has ordered any town she's not in to be burned to the ground. We beat up on what's left of the Ironclad boss from the missile base, only to have Selphie's group crawl out of the wreckage. I guess they hid under that thing for like 2 straight weeks or something? I don't know. But we get a nice little change of pace from the usual dreary thoughts that Squall has. The decision to send them to the missile base is something that we see him wrestle with, so it's a nice touch to see that he's happy they returned in one piece. It also seems to be the first time that he really thinks of them as friends rather than comrades. But more importantly, Edea is clearly after Alone for her time abilities. Now, Alone technically isn't a sorceress. Her ability to see past events isn't really magic. It's described more as a junction. Just like people can junction GFs, Alone can essentially junction her mind to other people's. But it's like she says, through using this ability, she also realizes that she has no magical power to actually change the past, just to view it. While giving his report to Cid, Squall is then abruptly named the new military leader of Garden. Obviously, Squall is not too happy about this, and he's just as confused about why he's being given this promotion. But Cid keeps talking about this destiny thing around Squall and the sorceress. And once again, Squall is pretty on the nose with this dialogue. While Squall sits around trying to figure out how to run Garden, Selphie and Irvine decide to have a concert for him. But there's more of a hidden meaning for this. Seeing as Rinoa is the only one who can kinda get through to Squall, her job is to try and get him to just open up about everything that's been going on. They know he's stressed, and this is their way of trying to help him. As an adult, I love Squall's initial response to this. There's no real reason he doesn't want to go, just twice in a row thinking how tired he is. We get down there, and Irvine thinks leaving porn for you and Rinoa to look at is a good start to a date. Irvine sucks. Choosing specific combinations of instruments is what actually influences Squall and Rinoa's dialogue, which isn't a great game mechanic because the average person has no clue what instruments should belong together. It doesn't help when you can't hear anything overlapping either. They're all played individually. But if I remember right, there's only one combination where Squall and Rinoa actually have a nice conversation. Then there's like 4 or 5 slightly different versions where Squall is different levels of a dick before Rinoa gets frustrated and leaves. This also highlights another problem with the writing. If the game hasn't made it obvious enough, Squall and Rinoa are going to get together, but you can further choose to make Squall even more of a dick to her whenever the game gives you dialogue options. When that's compounded with scenes like this where Squall is almost guaranteed to be an asshole to people who repeatedly bend over backwards for him, it has the potential to leave a very bad taste in the player's mouth. When the two eventually do get together, it just doesn't feel rewarding for most players. It feels contrived. Everybody heads back to Garden, and we then get another flashback to little Squall waiting in the rain, and it doesn't really help the emo accusations. Rinoa kinda gives him some shit back during most iterations of this scene, but I'd love to see some of the other party members do it too. Outside of one scene with Quistis later on, I don't know if there's ever times where people other than Rinoa call Squall out. Squall's relationship with the rest of the group borders on Mary Sue internet meme territory. For the majority of the game, he's such an asshole to all of them, and they just keep smiling and being happy about it, which further makes people dislike Squall. The game really needed a scene where Squall is trying to be nice for once, and that person is a dick back to him for no reason.
Wonder what this feels like. Ow! That hurts! My God, is that what I've been doing to people?
Now that we have control of Garden, Squall decides to go back and check on Balam, which is conveniently the next target Edea picked in her search for Alone. We get an old school mechanic where we go talk to random NPCs in a specific order to then trigger a fight with Fujin and Raijin. This actually has a little bit of payoff though. Those two say that they don't agree with Cypher or the Sorceress, but they've always been the clique, Cypher's their friend, and they support him regardless. Squall then decides to let them go if they try and talk Cypher down from his new position. Sounds good on paper, but none of them are aware that Cypher is actually being mind-controlled and doesn't fully understand what he's doing. But, piggybacking off of everything I just complained about, this does kinda make Squall realize maybe he shouldn't be such a dick to the people who support him. But in defense of this, the party is usually pretty spot on whenever they describe Squall. The game likes to make him seem so stoic and insightful, but we see a ton of times where the other characters just laugh off his behavior. Squall doesn't realize that his friends tend to read him like a book, which I guess is a little bit of an explanation as to why they put up with his attitude. Up next, we go see the aftermath of the Trebia Garden attack at Selphie's request. This is actually kinda sad, just a bunch of student NPCs talking about how their friends were blown up. But this leads into the game's most well-known twist.
Let me get this straight. Does anyone here not have amnesia?
I don't know.
So this starts off with Renoa finally admitting that she feels like she's falling behind in combat, that she's scared of losing people and would love to just stop fighting. Irvine chimes in and relates this to how he grew up in an orphanage, which, one by one, Selphie, Zell, and Quistis then remember they were there too. And of course Baby Cypher and Baby Squall were there, fighting with each other even back then. But that's not all. Alone was the cis person that Squall kinda remembered, but not really. In the middle of this ridiculous twist, there is one small thing that tends to get glossed over, which is Squall finally admitting that he didn't turn out okay at all. It's quick, but little by little, Squall is kinda accepting that he needs to relax. But back to the twist though. The group talks it out and realizes this must mean that the rumor of GFs causing memory loss is true. I feel like this is where people really lost interest. It's not the whole orphanage twist per se that makes people tap out, but that getting explained with the utter plot convenience of GF causing memory loss that makes people really roll their eyes. The game doesn't make this abundantly clear, but Balam Garden is pretty much the only place in the world where people use the power of GFs. It's not even a garden thing, as Trebia Garden and Galbadia Gardens don't support using GF for this supposed reason. But the player has little to no chance of knowing this. There's literally like one or two random NPCs that will mention GFs and memory loss in passing, but the main source of this knowledge comes from checking Squall's computer, which is a mechanic that very few players used, some didn't even really know about, because the game rarely tells people that it's an option. With no previous understanding of how GFs work, the whole amnesia sequence and conveniently blaming GFs seems extremely forced. But that's not even it. There's more plot convenience when Selphie admits that she found a random GF on a training mission in Trebia and junctioned it without anyone knowing. How convenient. But the hits just keep on coming. The lady in charge of the orphanage was Sorceress Edia. Or just Edia back then. But that's right, before she became the dictator of Galbadia, Sorceress Edia was basically everyone's mom. For anyone who's a little younger or who didn't play a ton of JRPGs, these kind of games having absolutely fucking ridiculous plots was basically a staple of the genre, but this scene takes the cake. Final Fantasy VIII is kind of viewed as where these insane JRPG plots jumped the shark. With Final Fantasy VII, literally millions of people didn't understand the plot when the game was released. So many people never understood the whole Genova subplot and genuinely thought that Cloud was just making everything up the whole time. Back then, Cloud was also a very divisive character for these reasons. With the internet becoming more and more of an everyday fixture and video games becoming more and more of a household item, this helped Final Fantasy VII stay relevant for significantly longer after its release. People kept learning more and more secrets and plot points that they never picked up on when playing the game. But those secrets and plot points were all present when people noticed them. It made them appreciate how well written the narrative was. Final Fantasy VIII had almost the opposite effect. The internet just taught people how to break the junction system, and further highlighted multiple times where major plot elements had little to no build-up or foreshadowing. But this whole scene is a lot of information to take in. For people who were 50-50 on the game, this is usually where they fully decided whether they loved it or simply tapped out. Even as a kid in grade school, I remember playing this for the first time and thinking, this feels really forced. It also doesn't really do Squall a ton of justice when the game tries to make you feel sorry for him by showing the flashbacks of him being a sad kid waiting in the rain. He lost his parents and his big sis. But so did everyone else, it turns out. Do we feel extra sorry that Quistis lost her family, that Alone left, and then it didn't work out with her adoptive family? No, because the writers don't fucking care about Quistis after Disc 1, let alone the player in this instance. The writer's attempt at giving Squall a sympathetic backstory completely backfires when you find out everyone went through the same things. Zell is the only one with a little bit of a change-up. His parents in Balam adopted him, and he ended up back at Garden because he enlisted on his own volition. Everyone else, Squall, Quistis, Selphie, Cypher, and Irvine, were just sent to Garden because they couldn't stay at the orphanage forever. When you realize that Squall isn't unique, it makes his personality that much more off-putting to a lot of players. Everyone else turned out fine, and they went through the same things. But it also could have been a way to show that not everyone handles trauma the same way, and that could have been a very interesting plot point had it been explored more. But they don't. This is why I say Squall is a very well-written character, but that doesn't always translate to him being likable. It's almost like they portrayed the worst version of a good character. Anyway, everyone decides to head back to the old orphanage to look for clues, but this is where Cypher is waiting for us as Galbadia Garden is now mobile. Kind of a funny moment, there is a little running gag of Squall always forgetting about Irvine. While giving his orders in preparation for battle, Squall just leaves out Irvine and later on admits that even with all the memories coming back about them as kids, he still doesn't remember Irvine from the orphanage. While organizing the Garden's defenses, Zell asks Squall to borrow his lion ring. This quick scene will literally be very important for the endgame and contributes to a big mistranslation in the American release. Zell asking for Squall's ring in the middle of battle preparations also foreshadows what turns out to be arguably the game's worst writing. The two Gardens start ramming each other, Squall gives a good speech, battles are everywhere, and Rinoa has crazy good grip strength. Seriously, she's just hanging there for like 20 minutes. This is a pretty terrible scene though. So Rinoa's in big trouble and about to fall to her death. Apparently, no one can save her except Squall. Everyone is freaking out and yelling at Squall to specifically save Rinoa, but he's thinking about how there are thousands of other people in Garden in similar danger. Eventually, Squall tells Zell to save Rinoa, and Zell gets pumped up about it and acts like the thought of someone else saving her never crossed his mind. This is another scene that people point to when they say that the romance feels forced. Why have all the characters yell at Squall to save her if he just turns around and tells someone else to do it? I guess Zell never made any real progress because eventually Squall does come to the rescue. When Rinoa does get saved, this will always be one of my favorite cutscenes though. Just like I said with the opening cinematic, this isn't much by today's standards, but it was fucking insane in 1999 to have Squall and Rinoa actively running through that CGI battle. But that awesome cutscene is followed by probably the game's worst writing. After seeing all that carnage that's still going on, like 5 feet out of frame, Squall and Rinoa have a little moment where you get to then name Squall's lion ring. Just focus on that battle again. There's fireballs, explosions, this dude gets clotheslined off a motorcycle by a fucking sword. This is like full-on Battle of Blackwater, but Squall and Rinoa just don't give a shit. Hell, Squall damn near breaks the fourth wall here too. If the player wasn't already thinking how forced the relationship between Squall and Rinoa feels, his character actively agrees and for some reason dismisses the thought of it. When they finish up, we fight our way through Galbadia Garden until we come face to face with Cypher and Edea again. Cypher is once again a complete pushover, and Edea escapes, so we just go to another room and fight. Edea starts off with a weird line though, mentioning how Squall is the legendary seed that's destined to face her. We have our boss battle, and this time we're able to defeat Edea. In the aftermath, Rinoa, clearly not under her own control, helps Cypher to his feet and then collapses. Being near death, Edea seems to have snapped out of her evil ways before we jump forward to the infirmary where Rinoa is still unconscious, and this is where the end of Disc 2 takes place. Disc 1, we set up what seems more like a modern political war story with fantasy elements. Disc 2 furthers this, but adds in some pretty ridiculous plot points, and get ready for more of those because this game goes off the fucking rails in Disc 3. With Galbadia Garden defeated, we can finally get into the orphanage where Cid and Edea are waiting for us. More exposition dumps and more plot twists. Edea might not have amnesia, but she's been possessed. We hear the name of the game's true big villain for the first time. Edea has been mind-controlled by a sorceress from the distant future named Ultimecia. It's Ultimecia's goal to find Alone, and she's been controlling Edea like a puppet. Whereas Edea was just influencing characters like Cypher and President Delling, Ultimecia was straight up mind-controlling Edea. All her weird speeches and that line about Squall being some legendary seed were Ultimecia's words. But there's even more sorceress stuff. We learn more about Sorceress Adele, who was that tyrant ruler of Esthar in the Sorceress War that we hear about from Laguna's time. Apparently Adele is no joke, and Edea believes that she's still alive somewhere. When Edea was on the verge of death against the Seeds, Ultimecia realized that she needed a stronger vessel, so she lets go of her grasp on Edea and wants to start searching for Adele. As Edea tries to fill in the party, all Squall can think about is Rinoa now. Just like the big information dumps we keep getting, it also seems really abrupt that Squall now gives a shit about Rinoa so much. When she was about to die during the garden battle, Squall had to be repeatedly told she's in trouble, and he didn't seem to really care all that much. He was still thinking more along the lines of the whole needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, and saying how she's not the only one in trouble. When she's practically leaving puddles behind after being saved, Squall even shrugs off the idea of them getting together. But now that he sees it firsthand, she's all he can think about. They were definitely going for a don't know what you got till it's gone scenario, but I can't stress enough how it happens right after Squall shows repeated disinterest. This fucking game just slingshots the plot back and forth sometimes. As Edea tells us about Ultimecia's plan of time compression, which is basically just a really, really strong variant of time magic, all Squall can think about is Rinoa. The amnesia twist felt really abrupt. GF's causing memory loss felt really abrupt. Edea being mind-controlled by a future sorceress felt really abrupt. Some new, very powerful sorceress named Adele who might still be alive felt very abrupt, and Squall now being obsessed with Rinoa felt very abrupt. In a vacuum, these are actually all pretty good plot elements and 100% set the foundation for a good sci-fi fantasy story. But it's how they are conveyed to the viewer that just make them seem really disorganized. Like, imagine if Cloud gave his calm flashback explanation of who Sephiroth was after he killed Aerith. Both Genova fights, you'd be thinking, what the hell, shouldn't I have known about this earlier? It's times like this where you can tell that Square started to stretch itself a little thin. The people in charge of Final Fantasy VIII were by no means rookies to game development, but they were rookies when it came to having final say in direction, and it shows at times. Squall then goes to visit Rinoa in the infirmary, and is again taken back to Laguna's time by Alone. This flashback of Laguna filming a movie is actually what gives Cypher his romantic dream to become a sorceress's knight. Cypher using a gunblade is also because Laguna's character in the movie does, and his stance is even the same as Laguna's. It's not exactly Baldur's Gate 3, but there are multiple little details like this that Final Fantasy VIII does really well and never really gets enough credit for. But the more important part is what we see afterwards, Laguna talking to Edea. It turns out that Esthar soldiers returned and were successful in their second attempt at kidnapping Alone, so Laguna, Kairos, and Ward all reunite to go save her. Alone also mentions how Rain gave birth to a newborn baby and died shortly after, all of which Laguna missed since he had already left to start the search. The game never flat out says it, so we'll just put it out there. Squall is that baby that Laguna wasn't around for. Laguna and Rain eventually married, and she became pregnant with Squall. Alone was then captured by Esthar, which made Laguna leave, before he knew he was about to be a dad. Rain then died shortly after giving birth, something that Laguna also wouldn't know for quite a while. So Squall and Alone aren't blood relatives, but this is why Squall also calls her Sis. Currently, he thinks it's just a nickname, since she was older than the rest of the group at the orphanage, when in reality Alone was actually Squall's older stepsister. After Rain died and Laguna wasn't able to return to Windhill, Squall and Alone were then sent to Edea's orphanage. Squall asks Alone to help him go back and find out what's wrong with Rinoa, but of course she can't. So now it's off to try and meet face to face with Alone again. Something else that should be noted, originally Laguna was supposed to have a much larger role in the game. He was supposed to be more of a dual protagonist rather than just the here and there flashbacks. Laguna was even supposed to have his own world map to travel. Obviously, a significant portion of his story was cut, and that seems to be the likely cause as to why there are large chunks of the map around Esthar and Trabia that just have nothing in it. They were probably supposed to be part of Laguna's travels. This is just guessing on my part, but it's a pretty educated guess that we were also probably supposed to learn much more about Adele, Alone, and Esthar through Laguna in the original development plans. But as production went on, for whatever reasons, huge chunks of Laguna's side of the game were cut, which does hurt the late game narrative quite a bit. But, once again, back to the game. After making a stop at the White Seed ship, yes, there's also White Seeds who live on a boat that were under Edea's command, but not possessed Edea, just Normal Edia, that is. Alone lived here for a while too. It's a whole thing, but not really that important in retrospect. When she left Garden a while ago, these are the guys she left with but later jumped ship. Literally. We learn that Alone is back in Esthar again. So Squall sets off by himself with an unconscious Rinoa to make his way there. This is meant to be a nice opening up moment for Squall, as he finally talks about himself to the half-dead Rinoa. Squall still doesn't really open up and get more friendly with everyone else, but it's a start. He finally admits his feelings for Rinoa, and admits that he stresses too much over what other people think about him. Would have been nice to see Squall have this conversation with someone who could talk back, but hey, it's character development that he badly needed at this point in the game. Either way, we finally get to see this Esthar city we've been hearing about, and it's significantly more advanced than anywhere else in the known world. It kind of makes you wonder how Sorceress Adele, with this kind of technology at her disposal, didn't immediately just take over the entire world. Right on time, we get another flashback to Laguna and Esthar. While looking for Alone, Laguna and his crew were captured and put to work as slave labor. During an eventual jailbreak, Laguna learns of Alone's whereabouts, and that there are a ton of people in Esthar that are part of resistance groups. Even though she's an all-powerful sorceress, Adele's reign has still put Esthar on the brink of a civil war. As Laguna frees Alone, Squall wakes back up in front of the highly advanced city. After talking to Dr. Odine and some people inside, we're pointed in the direction of something called the Lunar Gate, and very quickly realize it's a literal name. We're going into outer space with no heads up. But it's not just space that comes out of nowhere. There's also this thing called Lunatic Pandora that's out now. Alright, so this is where even more stuff happens with very little to no backstory. So inside Lunatic Pandora is this thing called the Crystal Pillar. Now, the Crystal Pillar is important because that can be used to summon monsters from the moon. That's a thing. So yeah, hold on to that thought, that's a big one. Everything in Esthar goes from happy to bad really quickly while Zell and whoever is left try to stop Lunatic Pandora, which they are unable to do. This guy tells us all about cryogenic sleep and traveling through space, but Zell runs around for like 20 minutes and Squall's already awake at the space station. I kind of feel like they didn't need to be frozen for that. They don't even try and make it seem like a couple days or anything has passed. Besides all the ridiculous plot elements coming out of nowhere, Final Fantasy VIII does have a handful of continuity errors in dialogue like this too. We finally meet back up with Alone, and everyone kinda glosses over how selfish her motives are. She put Squall through all this not to stop any evil sorceress or try and better the world, but to just try and stop Laguna from leaving Windhill. When she realizes that she can't change the past, she keeps sending Squall back, just so she can see how much she was loved and looked out for. So this is where that whole thing about Squall being Laguna's kid would have been really important. It's implied through dialogue with Kairos, Laguna, and Alone that they're all now aware of who Squall is through Alone's visions of the past. After she realizes that she can't change the past, Alone's motives for then still sending Squall back to Laguna's time was to learn enough to try and regain what's left of her family in the present. Like, that's kind of a big character moment, and it gets all but completely left out of the narrative. It's not even hinted at in the ending cutscene or anything. It's just a missed opportunity. There's no way around it. Then after all this stuff about not being able to change the past, Squall ends the conversation with, "Hey, come on, I want to warn Rinoa about what happened and we can try and change the past." Like, god damn it, Squall. Before we go to Rinoa, we stop in the control room and learn that a Lunar Cry is starting. Now, we have no fucking clue what the Lunar Cry is, but this is actually a global catastrophe. So remember how the gardens were these mobile shelters? They were shelters for an extinct civilization called the Centra. No, not the other extinct civilization of the Cetra like Aerith, the Centra. They probably should have named it something different, but yeah, the Centra were the last civilization before the world as we know it now was formed, but they were taken out by a Lunar Cry. Since Galbadia somehow now has control of the Crystal Pillar, they've instigated a new Lunar Cry. I'm sure it was in an issue of Timbermaniacs or something, but they probably should have mentioned how monsters can fly around space and destroy continents before this portion of the game. But even more plot twists. Rinoa has been a sorceress this whole time too. Now she's under the control of Sorceress Ultimecia, and she's going out into space to unlock the seal on Adele's tomb. Yes, conveniently for Ultimecia, Adele's tomb is also out by this very space station. That's a thing we're just learning now too. We'll eventually see through a flashback that Adele was defeated and frozen like Han Solo. This was done to make sure that she could never pass on her powers to anyone else. Since she was never killed, she was left to stay frozen in space till the end of time. But now, Ultimecia made this crazy-ass plan to ditch Edia, then get the Crystal Pillar, to start a new Lunar Cry. She'll control Rinoa. See, this is a pretty big thing that seems really thought out by Ultimecia. But if Alone never went to space to try and reunite with Laguna, then this whole crazy plan that Ultimecia made kind of falls apart. But lucky for us, Rinoa is in space, and she goes out and unlocks Adele's tomb. The whole point of initiating the Lunar Cry is so that Adele's tomb gets caught in the middle and comes crashing back down to Earth along with the now revived Adele. The Crystal Pillar catches Adele's tomb, but the game kind of forgets about that, hundreds of miles tall fountain of monsters that just got blasted through space onto the planet. We do see that Esthar is getting overrun with monsters, but for something that wiped out an entire continent and civilization, it seems like everyone in the current Lunar Cry is holding up pretty well in retrospect. Alone shows us what we've already figured out, and that Rinoa is possessed by Ultimecia. Squall then goes out in space to save Rinoa, and the two just happen to float into a long-lost spacecraft called the Ragnarok. While it's far from the only one that Esthar ever made, finding this spaceship in the middle of space is just another plot convenience in a now long line of plot conveniences that happens during this space adventure in Disc 3. But on this spaceship, alive and well, Squall and Rinoa finally have a moment where they can bond. Squall, as uncomfortable and pragmatic as always, keeps flipping between trying to assess their situation of being stuck in space, while also acknowledging the pretty sorceress girl who's literally throwing herself at him. When they get back home, Squall lets Esthar take Rinoa into custody because that's what she wanted. Rinoa's terrified to learn that she could end up the same way as Edia or Adele, that she could also be controlled, people would fear her, and that she would have to fight her friends. Rather than face any of this, Rinoa decides it's best to let herself be locked away like Adele was. Squall doesn't argue because it kinda makes sense, and he doesn't want to go against Rinoa's own wishes. Well, until the whole party, and specifically Quistis, call Squall an idiot and remind him of everything he just went through to try and save her. Squall comes to his senses, we break Rinoa out, and hey, it's the logo. We've had access to some of the world map, but now that we have an airship, we have the whole map at our disposal. There are some side quests to finish up, but there's never really a big reason to revisit any locations again, unless you're looking for specific Triple Triad cards. The majority of Disc 1 and 2 revolves around the war between Balam Garden and Galbadia, and then Disc 3 is almost entirely about Esthar. As a whole, this just isn't a very memorable world, and the majority of locations never really need another look. We're in the home stretch now, so let's start to wrap this up. Knowing that she's potentially a ticking time bomb, Rinoa wants to be away from people she could potentially hurt, so the group heads to the old orphanage again. Squall and Rinoa conveniently make a promise to meet up here if they ever can't find each other. This is finally a nice scene between Squall and Rinoa though, and they hit all the angles. It goes from joking and flirting all the way to Rinoa wanting Squall to be the one to kill her if she gets possessed. Knowing that she'd be evil, we even see Squall decide that he'd rather defend her than kill her. It took all goddamn game, but we finally have a well-written romance scene between Squall and Rinoa. But it's also a good thing that Squall didn't say that line about being her knight out loud. Would have solved a huge problem if Ultimecia found out that part. As they do this, Zell comes barging in to say they've been summoned back to Esthar by Kairos. Laguna has a plan to stop both Adele and Ultimecia. Yep, Laguna climbed the ranks all the way up to being president of the world's most powerful country. In fact, he was actually the one who imprisoned Adele all those years ago. I always thought it was funny how his genius plan of trapping her was to just say, fuck it, I'm just gonna push her into this thing, and it works. Just another example of Laguna being an idiot, but somehow coming out on top. Laguna does make a good point though, saying how Adele was just careless, that she might be a sorceress and controlling a powerful country, but in the end, she was still human too, and those senses of power and control left her prone to mistakes. Since Adele was a magical dictator, there wasn't really any line of succession, and being the person who trapped her, Laguna ended up in charge of Esthar over time. Now we get even more Deus Ex Machina plot devices. So Dr. Odine made a machine that mimics Alone's power, because of course he did. As the decades went on, probably even centuries, more and more advancements to the machine were made until it became more powerful than Alone herself. Eventually, far in the future, Ultimecia got her hands on this technology. She was able to use her own magical powers in tandem with this machine that mimics what Alone can do. But the machine does have a limit, and Odine believes that Ultimecia needs to go even further back in time, which is why she's searching for Alone herself. Odine gives a long explanation about how time compression works, and how we'll be able to then use it to defeat Ultimecia. Right about now, the player's probably confused as hell, and god damn it, once again, the game has Laguna say how he doesn't get it either. But then a minute later, Laguna is telling us the exact same strategy, and it sounds like he understands it perfectly fine. If all this wasn't crazy enough, the way you survive in a time-compressed world is by believing in your friends. Yes, when Ultimecia, Thanos snaps existence into a singularity and hopes to reshape the world in her image, you make it through something like that by believing in your friends. In another bad example of characters saying what the player is thinking, Squall tells Laguna how that idea is really corny. From here on out, the game turns into one big boss rush. We break our way into Lunatic Pandora and start off by beating Fujin and Raijin again, who are still supporting Cypher. We make our way through, and this time beat that robot who launched Zell out from earlier. Fujin and Raijin are back, and they're holding Alone captive, but finally have a change of heart and let her go. They tell Cypher they're quitting, and enough is enough. Cypher is once again one of the easiest bosses in the game, but he manages to grab Renoa and toss her to the now fully thawed out Adele. With this, we're in the endgame now as we start Disc 4. We see the kind of power that Adele has as she junctions Renoa into herself. In a game that doesn't deviate much with its combat, this throws a nice little wrench into the plans of anyone who just spams the strongest spells in GFs. You can and will kill Renoa this way, since they target both Renoa and Adele. This is a nice bit of storytelling through showing the player something, rather than Final Fantasy VIII's usual method of just blurting out plot points. Yes, Adele is a sorceress, but as Laguna says, she's also human. All sorceresses aren't created equal, and Adele clearly has some form of magic where she can augment her very own body, seeing as how she has the physique of a 12-foot-tall man, and can junction Renoa into herself. It's too bad that Adele is here and gone in a flash, because this could have been something really cool to explore. But nonetheless, we defeat Adele, save Renoa, and head to Ultimecia's time. Technically we're on Disc 4 now, but it's pretty much just the final dungeon. But this is a hell of a final dungeon. As a whole, Final Fantasy VIII is a very flawed game, but Ultimecia's castle is arguably the best final dungeon in the entire Final Fantasy franchise. The horror and gothic aesthetics are fantastic, most of the puzzles are good, the music is great, there's a secret super boss, and your abilities have been locked away behind Ultimecia's magic. In order to reclaim those skills, you need to make your way through the entire castle, beating her personal servant monsters. They nailed Ultimecia's castle. Get through all this, and it's time to end the game. Final Fantasy games around this time were known for having pretty bad translations, and 8 is no different. In America, Ultimecia comes off as an extremely generic villain who just wants to watch the world burn, 'cause she's evil style character. Her original Japanese counterpart is a bit different. Remember way back when I said I'd explain why Squall was healed up and kept alive after the first fight with Edea? That's because Ultimecia genuinely doesn't know what Seed's true purpose is. She lives in a future where sorceresses were hunted down. Seed no longer represented what it was meant to, and all she knows them as are people who want her dead because she's different. It seems like a small change, but it makes Ultimecia a significantly different character. At first, she's genuinely curious as to why sorceresses have been hunted for so long. She lives in a world where her kind is just killed off without a second thought by Seeds, and she doesn't even know why. Either way, in the end, Ultimecia is an evil character, but it does paint her justification in the future in a much different light. Back to the prison, this is why Irvine is allowed to leave after the fight with Edea too, because he's not a Seed, so Ultimecia doesn't give a shit about him. This is why Caraway can get Renoa out so easily as well. Ultimecia doesn't care if Renoa and Irvine attacked Edea. They don't matter towards her current goals of learning Seed's motive. Eventually, she learns about this legendary Seed who's destined to defeat her. When Squall and company defeat Edea, she now knows that Squall is this legendary Seed. The whole reason she wants to achieve time compression after this fight is to eliminate any threat from the past or future. But by actually starting the process of time compression, she fulfills the prophecy and literally brings Squall right to her doorstep. She causes her own downfall through her curiosities and fears. There's also a huge mistranslation when she summons the GF Griever too. In America, she just summons it and says it's the most powerful GF, while we all wonder how she has a GF that Squall named. In the Japanese release, she draws the thought of an extremely powerful GF named Griever out of Squall's mind. Squall has a lion ring because he believes lions to be a source of great strength. Ultimecia essentially uses Squall's own thoughts against him and makes a crazy strong GF to try and intimidate him. That's so much cooler than the American version. And just like Adele did to Renoa, Ultimecia then junctions herself to this GF. After this form of Griever is defeated, Ultimecia gets a pretty gnarly looking final form. I have no clue what all the symbolism behind it is, but this boss design is just really, really cool. Ultimecia's final form looks more like a Silent Hill monster than a Final Fantasy one, but I love everything about it. With Ultimecia defeated, we finally get the scene that ties everything together. When Ultimecia goes back in time and gives Edea her powers, Squall also ends up in that same timeline. He then tells a very confused Edea about Seed and Garden before trying to return to his own spot in time. In this universe, time runs on a flat line. The easiest examples of this are the Terminator and Futurama, specifically Terminator 1 and how Fry is his own grandfather. There are no alternate realities, no parallel universes, just one reality where Fry was always in 1947 and where Kyle Reese was always there to father John Connor. With this same idea of time travel, Squall has technically always been this legendary seed from the future, despite not being from Ultimecia's time. Just like how Ultimecia technically dying in the past through time compression doesn't stop her from existing or being born in the future. Unlike a ton of sci-fi and fantasy stories, Final Fantasy VIII's narrative is based around embracing your destiny and embracing your fate rather than trying to avoid it. No matter how much Squall doesn't want to be a leader or have people depend on him, that's exactly what he needs to do because it's literally fated to happen. On the opposite side, Ultimecia, in an attempt to defy her fate, unintentionally makes sure that she follows her exact destiny of being defeated by this mysterious, legendary seed. Edea makes the connection that this little kid she's taking care of is actually the same person who's standing in front of her. This is why Sid takes constant special care to make Squall a leader. When the game seems like Squall is getting favorable treatment, it's because he actually is. It's not just because he's the protagonist of the narrative, it's because Sid needs to make sure that fate, time, and possibly the fabric of their entire universe stays on the correct path. Sid and Edea needed to keep his fate a secret from him, but also make sure that he was ready for the challenge when the time came. The two of them have no clue if timelines can be changed, or if Ultimecia can somehow avoid her fate and win, so they do everything in their power to make sure that Squall and the rest of the group do as they're supposed to do. At one point, Sid even mentions how he thought he'd have more time. This is why things like the Seed exam are rushed and Cypher is put in charge when he has no business being an authority figure. If something went wrong, which it did, inevitably Sid knew Cypher could take the blame and Squall could still be given a passing grade. Everything was actually very carefully planned out by Sid and Edea to make sure that Squall was kept on this path. They spent their entire lives making sure everything future Squall told them from the orphanage became a reality. But there is still the problem of overcoming time compression to return home. Squall's trying to use his memories of Renoa and the flower field to get back, yet time compression is pulling him further and further away. Essentially, it's Ultimecia's death throes trying to take Squall down with her as everything resets back to normal. But Renoa eventually finds Squall, she saves him for once, and we see everyone has their happily ever after ending. While the game wraps up in a pretty conclusive fashion, let's quickly go over a few of the most popular fan theories that are out there. First up, Renoa is definitely not Ultimecia, which kinda bums me out a little bit. I thought this theory was a slam dunk for a while, but a ton of the supporting evidence hinges on Griever and the bad American translations. The quick version of the theory goes like this. Renoa becomes a sorceress and outlives all her friends. Over the years, the feelings of loneliness and loss take over, and she tries to find a way to relive her happiest memories from when she was younger and with Squall and the rest of the group. But because of the GF, As the years and decades go on, she can't even actually remember her friends. She just wants to go back into a time when she remembers being happy. Little by little, she becomes exactly what she feared, someone who was hunted and hated by the world. With more and more of her memories lost to time, Sorceress Rinoa slowly fades away and turns into Sorceress Ultimecia. As she eventually forgets Squall, she creates a GF in his likeness of what little that she can remember, the Lion Griever. If you're just going by the American dialogue, this theory actually fits surprisingly well and would have been a morbid but really cool plot twist. But the writers have said this is not true, and when you read the Japanese translations, the theory loses almost all of its value. For most players, I think this was simply a way they justified Ultimecia being the final boss. She does kinda come out of nowhere, and her motives in the American release are extremely vague. She's just bad guy who's doing bad things. Rinoa being Ultimecia gave some background and motivation to a character that most players thought had none. But again, this is mostly due through poor translation rather than the character itself. But for the people who don't care about that, with the American version, Rinoa as Ultimecia actually makes a ton of sense, but unfortunately that still doesn't make it true. I also don't think that Irvine got the yips because he recognized Edea as their matron. He didn't seem all that worried about it during the speech, and he freaks out before he ever looks at her through the scope. If you search FF8 Irvine on Google, his wiki article is the first thing that comes up, and just has flat out wrong information in it, which really isn't anything new for these sites, but it's worth pointing out as incorrect. It flat out says that he sees Edea through his scope, then freaks out. That never happens. Irvine is freaking out right when Squall hands him the rifle, and long before he gets a good look at Edea. He also doesn't have any trouble taking the shot when Squall calms him down, and then fights in the subsequent battle. As Squall says, his aim was dead on when he does take the shot. As far as we know, Irvine was never in any real combat scenarios before this. He was just their best marksman. There's a big difference between practice and the real thing. For good measure, if you scan Irvine, his character description literally says that he doesn't perform well under pressure. That whole sequence around the assassination is meant to show the immaturity and lack of experience in the group. It's meant to show every other character as screwing up, and why Squall gets looked at as the leader despite being an ass to everyone. It's been a huge debate over the years, but I think it's one where players are making excuses for the writing. I think this one is exactly as the game explains. He just cracks under the pressure. There have also been theories coming up about how Irvine is actually a spy from Galbadia the entire time that are kinda cool. It's a big theory, so I'm not going to cover it here, but there's a ton of them on Reddit you can read. I still don't know if I buy it though, and I think Irvine is just a what you see is what you get character. The last of the big theories is that Squall actually died fighting Edea the first time. This is a really popular fan theory, and the evidence behind it is mostly how ridiculous the plot gets after that fight. It's the whole Jacob's Ladder idea. Squall died when he was impaled with the ice lance, and the rest of the game was nothing more than his final thoughts as he died. The main evidence for this is that the game starts off as pretty grounded in its own reality, but then things like Rinoa falling in love with Squall for no reason, going into outer space, and time-traveling sorceresses start showing up. What we finished with in the endgame plot is significantly different than the early game. But no, I don't think Squall is dead, and that would be a terrible twist for a 40-hour game. The Squall is dead theory, Rinoa being Ultimecia, and Irvine recognizing Edea right away all have one common theme. These theories exist because it's people trying to make excuses for what is just a really messy narrative. Those are the biggest theories around the game, but another smaller one that has gained some traction is that Selphie is actually a sorceress too. The whole evidence behind this is her limit break using magic without a GF. But people tend to forget that the game shows us plenty of times that you don't specifically need a GF to cast magic. Selphie doing this is just one of many ways, like Galbadian soldiers casting magic or Cypher's limit break too. Selphie is probably not a sorceress herself. Contrary to how this video might seem, I actually like Final Fantasy VIII a lot. This was one of my favorite games growing up, even though that's with some pretty heavy nostalgia goggles on. But I've always described this as the best bad game that I've ever played. Playing Final Fantasy VIII is like watching a campy movie. You need to know what you're getting into beforehand. You don't watch Commando for its Godfather-esque storytelling. You watch it because it's equally as stupid as it is entertaining. That's Final Fantasy VIII. It's a heavily flawed game, but it's a game that can be fun if you're into the genre, and you know that you probably shouldn't take it too seriously. I do think it gets a lot more hate than it deserves, though. Now, there's a reason I've brought up Final Fantasy VII more than a few times in this video, because Final Fantasy VIII's biggest sin is that it wasn't Final Fantasy VII. For anyone on the younger side, you probably don't realize just how big of a deal the original Final Fantasy VII was. It wasn't just a massive commercial success, it was a game that literally changed the entire industry. At the time, it was the most expensive game ever made, and changed the way that AAA games were developed. Because of the Nintendo 64's hardware limitations, Square famously had to switch to the PlayStation, and Sony rode that all the way to the bank. Besides being recognized as an all-time great game, Final Fantasy VII was a massive part of why Sony overtook Nintendo in the late 90s and 2000s. And Final Fantasy VIII just wasn't that. Yeah, critics reviewed it very well at the time, but the average player didn't see things the same way. Final Fantasy VIII's commercial success was always attributed to being the game that came after 7. Hell, series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi didn't even like the game, and was very open about it in interviews. In fact, Sakaguchi planned on leaving the series, but specifically came back to a much more hands-on role in 9 because he was so unhappy with how 8 turned out. The advent of the internet didn't help matters either. 7 suffered from a poor translation as well, which left out a lot of the details with the Genova experiments and Cloud's backstory. But once the internet became a household thing, online forums and sites like GameFAQs gained traction, this let Final Fantasy VII stay in the limelight. They found more secrets about the game, they learned that Cloud wasn't just faking his memories, they debated whether Sephiroth or Genova was really the dominant personality, and people spent years trying to find a way to revive Aerith. While Final Fantasy VIII had a narrative that was all over the place, 7 had plot points that actually became more important in everyday life as time went on. Mental health issues, environmentalism, corporations gaining global power, and terrorism grew into bigger and bigger topics in real life that were also core elements in Final Fantasy VII's story. Squall and company just couldn't compete. Final Fantasy VII was obviously the big one, but we had also gotten spoiled with other JRPGs that told great stories like Chrono Trigger, Xenogears, Final Fantasy VI, and Suikoden 2. Yes, Final Fantasy VIII has problems with its gameplay and rushed storytelling, but most JRPGs of that time did. It's not a problem that's exclusive to Final Fantasy VIII at all. Games like the ones I just mentioned made people kind of forget that those are the outlier titles. It's far from perfect, but the biggest hurdle that 8 always had to overcome was being the follow-up to Final Fantasy VII and coming out in a time when multiple all-time greats were released. Cloud became an iconic hero, Sephiroth became an iconic villain, and Tifa had huge pointy tits. Squall, Ultimecia, and Rinoa just couldn't compete, and that left Final Fantasy VIII with an uphill battle from the start. But just because it wasn't Final Fantasy VII doesn't mean that it's a bad game. I actually think that most of the plot is pretty good. If you explained everything to someone in a vacuum, it has all the makings of a cool sci-fi story. It's not that the story per se is the issue, it's that the game's storytelling itself is pretty bad. But now that you can play the remastered version and greatly speed up grinding for magic, give Final Fantasy VIII a shot. You just might like it. Alright guys, that's all I've got for this one. You know all about the like, comment, and subscribe stuff. Do so if you give a shit. But I'll probably try and look at a couple more divisive games maybe I'll make some videos on. I've got a couple in mind, but if you guys liked this one and you got any other ones that you want me to possibly add to the list, toss it in the comments, I'll look into it. But again, that's all I've got. Thanks for watching.